take yourself off. So again, yeah, welcome to Fire PSEG, Reimagine LIPA. My name is Ryan Mann with the Long Island Progressive Coalition. As I was noting before we started the recording, that we'll have about 25 minutes of presentation followed by a Q&A. And we will be recording, so if you prefer yourself to be off camera, please do so. And to avoid the potential overwhelm of messages during the presentation, we're gonna have the chat disabled for now. But we'll open that right up back at when the Q&A starts. So please keep your questions ready, because we're also going to do our best to collect all of them if we're not able to answer them live, and we'll pass that along thereafter. And so with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Professor Mike Mentzer.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Thanks everybody for joining tonight. And, you know, I was conscious about the 7:37 p.m. time, but the Yankee game is rained out tonight. So I'm glad that we got a clear hour to kind of get into the details here. So again, I'm Mike Mentzer. I'm a Nassau County resident and a professor at Brooklyn College in CUNY and a member of the Reimagine LIPA campaign. So tonight, what we're going to do, who are we? Why are we doing this? What's this new legislative commission that we're hearing about now in the media? What's our proposal for a democratic, accountable, resilient, and renewable power utility? Yes, we have an ambitious set of demands, but that's what we need and that's what we deserve here in Long Island. What's the opposition saying? We're seeing some criticisms and questions floating around. What are our responses? And then we'll get into why the time to act is now, next steps, and how to get involved. So who are we? We're the Reimagine LIPA campaign. As Ryan was mentioning, we have a number of different coalition partners in our campaign, groups that work in the energy space, groups that work on social justice, group that works on issues across the island and the Rockaways, and all felt that this issue is so important and so urgent right now that we had to do this campaign and get the transformation of our utility to happen. I myself, so I kind of come at this from two angles. I'm also one of the folks who's very angry about the electric utility service situation, having been a resident of Long Island now for more than a decade with my family. I live in Nassau County. I suffered through Superstorm Sandy. We suffered through Tropical Storm Isaias. There's issues with affordability and so on. But I also happen to be studying and doing research and teaching about these same issues. I work with climate scientists at a Science and Resilience Institute that's based in New York City. I work with local government, with state government and federal government on these issues. And I also co-founded a nonprofit called the Participatory Budgeting Project, which has worked with more than 20 cities across the United States to get the public more control over public budgets. So we see all those different issues converge in the electric utility space, issues around climate, issues around accountability, and issues around who has the say to make these utility run in the way that it should to contribute to the public good here in Long Island, in the Rockaways. So before we get into the presentation, understanding the basics. This is a confusing issue for a lot of folks. It was a confusing issue to me when we moved out here to Long Island. We have a very unique setup in terms of our electric utility. We have the Long Island Power Authority. It's a public authority that was created about 35 years ago by the state of New York. And it took over the grid from LILCO. Some of y'all, the old timers will remember LILCO and what happened with LILCO. It was a debacle. So Mario Cuomo, the governor at the time, created LIPA, and it owns the grid. However, it does not maintain or operate the grid. Since it was created in that initial phase, it has contracted out the maintenance and the operations of the grid, initially to National Grid, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And then with Superstorm Sandy, it flipped over to PSEG, which is a New Jersey-based private corporation that manages and operates the grid. We pay the bill to PSEG, so everybody knows PSEG. They are supervised by LIPA. Then National Grid, right? National Grid's still in the mix. Unfortunately, a lot of us are still paying bills to National Grid too. That's on the gas side. So for your heat and for your stove, that's where the bill goes. But when it comes to the electric utility, it's LIPA and it's PSEG. It's a combination. It's a public-private hybrid. And it's monitored, or not monitored very well, from our perspective, by a special office on Long Island of the Department of Public Service. And that also is going to be part of the vision that we're looking to transform here on Long Island and the Rockaways. And I want to make sure I keep doing that, right? So ever since LILCO, going back decades, the electric utility for Long Island has always included the Rockaways. So that makes things a little bit more complicated jurisdictionally, because we got the two counties, we got the Suffolk County and Nassau, but then we also have part of Queens, not all of Queens, but the Rockaway Peninsula, nestled there between Jamaica Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. It's about 1.1 million customers. It's over 2 million people total. Those are households and businesses. And so that's the service area for the utility. LIPA itself doesn't have that many employees at this point. It's about 50, maybe a little bit more than that, primarily managerial, analysts, administration. And then there's a board of trustees that it's a little over half supported by the governor, and the other 4 are appointed by the legislature. So again, LIPA contracts to PSEG to maintain the grid. That's the line workers, that's transmission, it's distribution, it's the planning of what kind of energy that we use, it's the information technology, it's the call centers, we'll be coming back to that, engineers, energy efficiency, and so on. PSEG also subcontracts out, not such a big issue for us tonight, some other services. And then PSEG has this cast of characters, which are the 18 managers, which are about a cost of $80 million a year for that service. And they deploy and oversee the workforce, which is called ServCo, which provides the utility core services. And that's about 2,500 or a little bit more employees at this point. And they're part of the union IBW. And PSEG, Long Island, and LIPA just signed a new contract that began in 2022 and ends in 2025. And that was Andrew Cuomo, who was governor. People might remember Andrew. He was the governor who put that deal in place. So why did we come together? Well, it really was precipitated by the poor response and poor planning for Tropical Storm Isaias, not Superstorm Isaias, not Hurricane Isaias, Tropical Storm Isaias. It wasn't supposed to be that big of a deal. The storm did pack a little bit more punch than we thought. But what frustrated folks wasn't just that the power went out, but when you called up or tried to get a hold of PSEG, you couldn't get through. And when you stood out front of your house because the lights weren't on or you didn't have AC, this was the summertime, I lost power this time and we're out. And we're watching the trucks go back and forth, right? And we're wondering who's in charge here, who's coordinating this. And we start to see the coverage in Newsday and in other places that PSEG wasn't prepared. PSEG was not functioning. Its IT, its call service wasn't functioning the way it was supposed to be. And they had misled LIPA about this. So the reason that the response was so bad and that the prep wasn't good was management failures. And this was the conclusion in a report that was done by LIPA in conjunction with the Department of Public Service. And this failed storm response was avoidable. It wasn't that it was such a powerful storm that what are we going to do? It was not. It wasn't a Sandy situation. It was much less strong storm, but the lack of prep and the lack of coordination and the deception about being ready was what cost us during Isaias. We've seen this before. If you've lived on Long Island more than 10 years, and I hesitate to even mention it, but this is the 10th year anniversary, right, of Superstorm Sandy this month. My house, we lost power for 2 weeks with 2 young kids. A lot of people had it worse than we did, but it was brutal. We've gone through this mess before. National Grid was so castigated and LIPA was so castigated for their prep and for the response that they redid the whole thing. They redid the arrangement. That was the Governor Andrew Cuomo. And that reconstruction at that time, which was called the LIPA Reform Act, but it kept the hybrid. It kept the public-private partnership. And what our argument is that we've tried a couple of different versions of this, and this public-private model doesn't work. It's not accountable. We're seeing that in the case of Superstorm Sandy. We've seen it in the case of Tropical Storm Isaias. We've seen it on other issues with regard to service and with regard to reliability and the rate structure. And we feel that it's time, along with a lot of others who are very dissatisfied with this hybrid model, for a new model. What are options? Well, there is another option, and it's the public ownership option, the public power option. In the United States, about 25% of the United States has publicly owned power utility. from California to Nebraska to Tennessee to New York State. There's a lot of public power utilities that do a great job of being reliable, of being accountable. And when you look at the numbers, public utilities tend to be more reliable. They tend to have less long outages. The response is better. The power comes back on quicker. And customer satisfaction tends to be higher with publicly owned utilities as opposed to privately owned utilities. So there is this other model, this public power model, and it's more accountable and has higher customer satisfaction. It also gives back more to the local community. It can benefit the local economy more, and it gives residents in the towns and the villages more of an opportunity to have a say in how the electric utility is run. Also, when you look at, and this is something in my research, right, the whole issue of renewable energy. Every time we emit the fossil fuels, right, it makes the future storms stronger. We have to cut back on those emissions. New York State has its goals. If you look at the United States, there's about 7 towns in the United States that are completely 100% renewable energy. All 7 of them are publicly owned utilities. Why? Because those ratepayers say, hey, we want public power because we own it. We want it to deliver renewables to us, to put us in a better situation with respect to the climate change and with respect to affordability. The nearest publicly owned utility to us that's 100% renewables is Burlington, Vermont. So our campaign, this is our idea, right? We're going with this public model, and we were able, after 2 years of fighting, about 1.5 to 2 years of fighting, to get legislation passed with the help of 2 elected officials, especially Senator Gorin and Assemblymember Thiel, to pass a bill which creates a commission to create a report and draw up a roadmap with the actions, legislation, and timeline necessary to restructure LIPA into a locally controlled, publicly owned and run power authority. This commission, which has 8 elected officials on it, it's supposed to cover all the topics that we would want to cover. How is it governed? How are we going to ensure accountability? How is it going to be transparent? How are we going to do public engagement? How are we going to improve the reliability of the system? What about the rate structure? The rates are going crazy right now, right? A lot of people, you have the utility debt, you have shutoffs. What are we going to do about the rate restructure? What's the plan for storm response and disaster response? What about the debt that LIPA has? That's a whole other story too. And then what about those climate goals that New York State has set, which are so ambitious? With this legislative commission, there's also to be an advisory committee. And that advisory committee is made up of representatives from communities across the service area, from business, from labor, local government, Indian nations and tribes, economic development, environment, schools, higher ed, and so on. So this is the bill that we hope to get passed, to have this legislative commission and an advisory committee advising. Here's the list of the 8 electeds, which are geographically representative of the service area and also are Republican and Democrat. Oh, the executive director, was just announced this past week that the executive director of the commission is Rory Lantzman, who has been involved with the energy space for the last couple of years and was also involved in the water utility with American Water most recently, that impacted on Long Island. The advisory committee is still to be appointed, and when its members are appointed, they will elect their own chair for the advisory committee. So the commission is behind, and this concerns us. There was an article in the paper about the commission being behind. It was supposed to already have had its first public hearing in September. We're hearing now that it should be in November. The commission is supposed to have a draft report of what the transformation will look like either in December or January. After that draft report is released, there's supposed to be public hearings then, so that the public has opportunity to look at that and comment on it. And the New York State Comptroller would review that. After that, hearings are happened and the town halls happen and the comments are delivered, the commission goes back to work to incorporate those comments and produce a set of legislation for the next legislative session in April of 2023. The legislature then would have to pass legislation to move this transformation forward. And the idea is to have the Long Island Power Authority be fully democratic, public, and locally controlled by 2025, when the contract expires. So this gives us a couple of years to really put into place all the different aspects that have to happen for the transformation to take place. So our campaign is for, again, local control, a fair rate structure, reliable service, equity for communities negatively impacted by the current system, and a common sense use of funds that benefits the public and not the shareholders, as a private utility has to do. What does that mean? Well, it means that the board members, which are now chosen by Albany, chosen by the governor and the legislature, those board members should be elected by ratepayers from Rockaways and Long Island. That's the way a lot of public power utilities do it across the United States. And we think this is the best route after looking a lot of different evidence and research on this for LIPA. The current corporate management is eliminated and a new, more accountable management structure is created, drawing from best practices from across New York and the United States. And there's lots of great examples from Sacramento, from San Antonio, from Seattle. And there's the New York Power Authority, there's Chattanooga, that have done a lot of innovative things in terms of their management structure. DPS Long Island is eliminated and a new independent energy observatory, a kind of institute that's watching what's happening, which we've drawn upon for some other examples from that, is established to monitor LIPA and engage and support communities. And there's already funding for that because the DPS Long Island budget is $11 million a year, which comes out of our rate, that comes from us, the ratepayers. So we could use some of that money. I don't even know if we need all that money, but we could use some of that money to have our own locally based observatory, which would be partnered with universities and community-based organizations across the island. Servco, the union, all that stays the same. And a restructured LIPA, we don't have to buy anything. LIPA already owns the grid. So if we were in New York City, right, and you have Con Edison, who's the utility, if New York City wanted to go public power, they would have to buy the grid from Con Ed. That's a very expensive proposition. It's probably over $10 billion to buy the grid from what I've heard. We don't have to do that. We already own the grid. So going fully public saves us money. It saves us money, right? Because the management structure, those high fees, those corporate dividends, we don't have to pay that. So the revenues then would be reinvested into the system rather than sent to shareholders. And it would be more local control and less interference from Albany, because Albany wouldn't be picking the board, we'd be picking the board. So what the critics are saying, more studies are needed. We've already done more than 7. How many more do you want? Are we going to wait for the next storm? Do we need another storm to make us do this? We've already had 2 massive storms and many other problems. We say we don't need more studies. We've done the studies. We've seen the failures. Act now. LIPA should be privatized. If you want to pay more money and have less accountability, then privatize LIPA. I bet if you do the survey of Long Islanders and Rockaway folks on that, they're not going to want to pay more money for less accountability. This is a government takeover. No, we hear this a lot and kind of get this, like, because it sounds like, sometimes they call it municipalization or, public power. This public power model makes more local control. It reduces interference from Albany. It's not a government takeover in the way that most people think about it. It's just the opposite. So we're seeing some of this misinformation on social media right now. There's definitely folks on the PSEG side and the Edison Electric Institute and Association, which is made up of private utilities, that are putting out some disinformation, but we think it's clear that they're wrong on all counts. So, and if you don't trust us on this, ask the ratepayers. When JD Power, who does the customer satisfaction analysis every year, asked LIPA and PSEG ratepayers, how do you think the utility is doing? We were second to last in the region. You see the red arrow? Second to last in the region. It's embarrassing, folks. Con Ed is ahead of us. Con Ed has a better customer satisfaction rating than PSEG and Long Island. My friends in New York are like, that's impossible. I'm like, it's not impossible. Look at the data. The only one that's worse than us is Central Maine. And in Central Maine, I've talked to them. They're trying to get rid of their utility too. So look at us. The 2 folks at the bottom are trying to get rid of our private utility to get that public model. And the other thing that we have right here is, well, maybe PSEG can do better. They're still failing to meet the standard for the customer information systems modernization, which is part of the backbone of their communications. And this is from the LIPA report that was done over the summer. And again, it says rejected. PSEG is still failing to do the work needed, the upgrades needed since the SIE's failures. It's been 2 years. It's been 2 years. and they're still failing to make the upgrades that they need to. Public power is better. Let's do this. Eliminate the third-party management. It lowers costs by about 70 million, according to the study done by LIPA and DPS. Studies show public power is more accountable and responsive after storms. Democratic public power, the kind of model that we're putting forward, is more equitable because it includes all voices and supports low to moderate income households, seniors, and partners to benefit communities. We need public power to become more renewable. We're only about 6% solar and wind right now on Long Island and the Rockies. 6%, right? We look before, there's several utilities that are 100%. We need to move faster to reach the New York State mandate of 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% by 2040. And partnered with a new energy observatory to replace the DPSLI, the Department of Public Service Long Island office, to do independent research and engage with the public. A restructured LIPA can become more democratic, innovative, and resilient. So this concludes my part of the presentation. We have 2 things to come. We're going to do Q&A where people get to ask questions and we can have some discussion on this. But before we do that, we want to come back to this DPSLI issue. And I'm going to turn it over to George Poval from All Our Energy to talk about another way that folks can get involved.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. And thanks for such an informative presentation to really help bring everybody up to speed. So hi, everybody. I'm George. And we happen to have a very good opportunity right now in that there is a audit happening for PSEG and LIPA right now by DPS. And we would love for all of you to take a little action. I'm going to put into the chat if I'm allowed. Okay, Ryan hit it. So there's an audit happening right now. And basically we have one day, it will be due tomorrow, but you can use our easy to use system. And you can add any comments you like to it as well. And it will go to the secretary of the DPS as well as the governor. And it will also go to your state legislators from the Assembly and the Senate automatically when you put your return address in. And so, you know, basically we are looking to critique the system. And there's a lot of things that really should be happening. When you click into that, you'll see we're talking about better representation from environmental justice communities, better protection for communities and for our system overall. And these are things that are not even included in the audit, and they're just like basic things. So we really want to hit them one last time. The closing of the comments is tomorrow. So if you could click on that Action Network link, you can always come back to it another time and fill in your any additional comments you want to do, or you can just click send, and that will go to all those people and be entered into the to the register of comments, and we would love for you to be involved. But that's really it. I think we're going to turn it over for Q&A now. So I think we'll ask for everybody to put your questions in the chat, and our team will compile them because probably some of them might be similar, and then we'll talk to them together. And I think I'll turn it back to Ryan. Ryan, did you have anything to add there?
No, that's great. I have just enabled the chat again, so people can put directly can put their questions directly into the chat. So keep the questions coming. We'll probably, as they come in, I'll ask a first one, and then our friend Marion over at Nassau DSA is collecting the rest of questions. Yeah, please keep them coming. I know there was a lot of information shared, and our intent is to answer as many questions as possible. And because Mike kept it nice and tight, we have plenty of time for an exchange and back and forth with folks here. So please put your questions into the chat, and I will be sure to answer, have Mike or others from our team answer them. Okay, so I think this is a nice hefty question to get us going. Please, everyone else, continue to ask your questions in the chat. But we have a question from Francesca Rhiannon, who says, please talk about what the relationship will be to the Public Service Commission, which governs utilities in the rest of the state. For a little bit of background, because investor-owned utilities are under the Public Service Commission, and as Mike shared, we're under this kind of public-private hybrid model, and our overseer is the Department of Public Service Long Island, created after Superstorm Sandy. So Francesca is asking because she's concerned, especially about the ability to do community choice aggregation, which is a particular model for advancing renewable energy. So I will kick that to you, Mike, to describe a little bit about the oversight mechanisms in our vision of a reimagined LIPA.
Thank you. And yeah, with the current oversight model, the Public Service Commission, which is very strongly subordinate to the governor and to the legislature to some extent, is what regulates utilities in New York State, water, electric, and others. And they are part of a regulatory structure that tends to be very favorable to private utilities in terms of guaranteeing them a certain rate of return, and allowing them to raise rates within certain types of parameters. Publicly owned utilities, ever since they were first, the whole system was first created 100 years ago, are not under those PSCs. They're not under those public service commissions in any state in the United States. And that gives them more freedom to set their own agenda. And it's also true at the federal level. There's a federal regulator called FERC, and it doesn't regulate publicly owned utilities in the same way. Publicly owned utilities are supposed to be responsive to the ratepayers and to the city or the county or the state that they're part of. So that's the reason for that. So the PSC is kind of this middleman that has certain sorts of powers and certain sorts of biases, and they're not interfering with public power's ability to operate. Now, the CCAs, I don't fully understand the question here, and because there are CCAs in New York State, right? So we see this as a sort of separate issue, a separate dimension. I'm not sure, is the question, if LIPA became fully public, would there not be able to be any CCAs going forward? Is that does anybody know, or can there be a follow-up there? Or that LIPA right now does not permit CCAs? So I don't know if anybody else from our team wants to weigh in on CCAs. I know a few of us, I see Billy, who want to talk about a particular aspect of this. Right.
Yeah, I would just speak to that to say that I would think that that would be part of the discussions about bringing those into the fore to be available. You know, part of this whole process really is to bring forth the ideas like this that may be missing from what we're getting now. And so, though I wouldn't say that that's like a guarantee that they would change, I think it's definitely part of the discussion, because the CCAs will in all likelihood, really help us get to different renewables and dispatchable, like battery storage and things like that. So I would think that should be on the table and should be.
Thanks for that, George.
Yeah.
Francesca, if there are any further questions around that, feel free to put it back in the chat. But I see there's a few more that have been put in.
Yeah, we have one from. Oh, I'm
sorry, Mary. It's just on that point. 2 points. One is that a lot of times CCAs are motivated by people who are frustrated with their utility, so they want to be able to get renewable energy or some sort of energy service by going around the utility. A main driver for making LIPA fully public is so it's more responsive to us, right? So we don't have to go around it. Now, that said, there still might be reasons why there should be CCAs. And that's something that the commission should look at. That's the whole point of the commission, is to look at, okay, well, what are the options here? If LIPA goes fully public, do we want CCAs? Are they still needed to serve some role, which LIPA wouldn't? And so it's a great question. And we really urge you to submit that as a comment, and we'll for sure register that as a comment for the commission. Go ahead, Marion, sorry.
Oh, so the next question is about accountability. How do we keep pressure on the LIPA transition committee to stick to the timeline? I think this is especially relevant given the article in Newsday about that they're already postponed the first deadline.
Great question. So we were heartened by the new executive director, Rory Lantzman, saying we're still going to be on target to deliver the draft report. But we're, folks are, we know we're not naive here. We know that we've got to keep pressure up. This is one of the reasons for doing these webinars, is to make this whole campaign and this new commission more available to folks so they are aware of what's going on and the possibilities around this. And so one basic way of keeping pressure is just, we're happy to go on the road, so to speak, the Zoom road, the actual road, to give these webinars or to make this information more available. We're going to launch a website here in the next couple of days where a lot of this information and materials will be available to groups and to really get the message out. And then there's 8 elected officials on that commission. A lot of folks will be in these folks' districts, but you'll know who they are. So you can pressure through the commission, the elected members of the commission. When the advisory committee, we'll be able to pressure through the advisory committee. But we also have to be ready to do other kinds of events or actions to make sure that this thing is moving forward. And we'll for sure, working with our allies in this campaign, like we've done, we did protests, we did calls, we testified at LIPA hearings, we were in Newsday, we wrote op-eds, we did the whole gamut. So we're ready to do the whole gamut and really encourage everybody to join us to keep the pressure on.
Michael, I have a piece to add about CCA. LIPA doesn't actually make it illegal to do a CCA. They just make it so difficult because what they're finding is that they have so many expenses to run things. And if you get a CCA, then you're paying them. And part of it is, I think, is also the rate structure. But my guess, and this is a guess, is that people who are on the CCA will not be helping to pay towards the Shoreham debt, which is $8 billion. That's a guess on my part. But I know that the problem is that LIPA wants you to continue paying for certain things that you normally wouldn't pay for with a CCA because you're paying that provider directly. So that I think is what's going on.
Thanks, Billy.
The next question is more of a comment from Eleanor that there's no guarantee that community decision-making on issues like environmental justice or meeting climate targets will be hashed out, especially with the divisiveness, I should say, of the communities on a variety of issues. So how could we all get together on this?
Great question. And in our when our website goes live, and we have a 2-pager, and then we have more details about our vision, we really take on both of these questions. So one is, how do you get the transition to 80% renewables, 100% renewables, whatever we think the appropriate goal is? How do you make sure that that's happening fast and given the urgent situation that we're in? And the second is to make sure that it's just, and it's not excluding communities who have been excluded, or it's not putting more burdens on communities that have already gotten.
What about the union workforce that's already working for LIPA? And
well, Marion, I don't know that Mike was done.
Oh yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think Marion may have froze. So on the environmental justice issue, so we have a lot of thoughts here, and we've looked at a lot of different examples across the country. A lot of utilities don't do a great job, especially on environmental justice issues. We have to, and Long Island and Rockaways could help set a new standard. 2 things. One is to make sure environmental justice is part of the mission of the board of the utility, that it's one of its core goals. So it's not just reliability and it's not just affordability, but it's also fairness, equity, and so on. The second is to make sure that those communities are represented on the board And also there's expertise about how to address those issues on the board. So that's one thing. But having the perfect board, even if it could be perfect, that doesn't solve the problem, right? Because you still have to be able to connect to the communities, and on Long Island, the Rockaways, the villages, the towns, the 3 counties. And that's where the Energy Observatory comes in. And we did a lot of research on different institutes that we've seen across the US and in other countries. And there's some really great models there of institutes that do long-term partnerships with communities and get them funding to be able to address these issues that really cut to the core of their needs. And so NYSERDA kind of does this, but not really, right? There's other programs now, there's money to do that, but there really a lot of time isn't the community coordination and support for communities to really get their needs addressed, whether it's renewable energy or dealing with burdens that are associated with energy infrastructure. So, which are 2 different big issues. So we really see the more democratic, locally accountable board, plus the Energy Observatory. We got all these great universities on Long Island. We can tap them. We can tap their researchers, their students. We got all these great groups across Long Island, the Rockaways. We can tap them. And to really do coordination around that. Because with the LIPA service area and with LIPA funds DPSLI to not do much. The only thing DPSLI has done in the last 8 years is renegotiate the contract with PSEG. And people didn't want him to renegotiate that. Cuomo did. So there's a budget there that can be utilized by an energy observatory or by some kind of community coalition or advisory committee or whatever to really make sure that the environmental justice issues are present, that those organizations are supported with technical expertise as well as funding, and empowered in the overall process of the governance of the utility.
I can field the next question. There was a question from George around what happens to the union workforce. Do you want me to take that one, Mike? Yeah, thanks for that question, George. As we noted in the presentation, there's about 2,500 workers currently under ServCo, the kind of separate entity that is contracted to carry out the day-to-day, kind of like the line workers, and the nitty-gritty of keeping the lights on. And we some of us from the campaign have met with IBEW Local 1049. It's very clear that workers do not want that the union does not want to be a part of become a public sector union. And so the intention and our vision and alignment with theirs is to keep the current structure the same. Nothing would have to change with ServCo and their union workers being a separate entity contracted with the utility. The Long Island Power Authority, in conversations around what would a full public transition look like, has stated that as such. So our intention is to be aligned with the union workers around what their wants and needs are in this transition, and again, have more of a say in decision-making and oversight over the utility through more democratic participation in this restructured LIPA. And it is our understanding that they will have a seat at the table for the actual advisory, for the legislative commission and the advisory committee process. So I don't know if anyone has more to add, but it's defer and support labor in this, and it's definitely our intent to do so.
All right, we have a question about taxes. There's a lot of property taxes and other taxes embedded within the electric rates that are part of the reason rates can be so high. Will this public model be able to avoid some of those taxes?
Right, another great question. Public utilities, because they are nonprofits, don't pay taxes in the same way that a private utility does. And there are these things called pilots, which some people will know a lot about if your community is involved with one of those, which is payment in lieu of taxes. And LIPA has been involved with a number of these negotiations over the last years. And they have had more or less tense negotiations and discussions with some towns. It can really vary, like the issues at play. And of course, taxes are, you know, the #1 issue of Long Island at all times. The Rockaways, it might be a little bit different actually. So this is something that we really want the commission to look at. How has LIPA handled the pilots? How, as some communities gotten better deals than others? What's the long-term plan here? We know which facilities are supposed to be shut down over the next 7 to 10 years. So let's get ahead of this. What's it going to look like? How do we make sure that those communities are fairly compensated? And how do we make sure that it's not just a one-time thing, but we're thinking about the long-term future of all the different communities across the service area? So that's a big issue and one that we really want the commission to make sure that they put in some in-depth analysis on.
Right, and while you're talking about money, what about the Shoreham debt that's part of the LIPA legacy?
Yes, so when LIPA was first formed 35 years ago, they purchased the grid from Lilco as part of what happened with Lilco, the dismantling of Lilco, purchased those assets. And we've been paying for it ever since. And there's a separate, what's called a debt securitization entity, which deals with the debt. And it's been restructured 2 times over the last 7 years, I think, or 8 years since the Reform Act of 2013. And this is another thing we want the commission to look at. There are a lot of different angles on this. And we really want to make sure that all the options are on the table. And it's not just one story that we're hearing from LIPA on this. This also involves a discussion with the state at the state level. There's a lot of new federal monies available to utilities and to the energy sector. Is it possible that could be involved with settling some of the debts here that LIPA has? I mean, one big thing that just happened the last couple of months with the Inflation Reduction Act, everybody's favorite name for a bill, is that before only private utilities could get a lot of the subsidies for renewable energy. Now nonprofits could get them. That means public utilities can get them. So this is a whole different set of very positive financial subsidies that LIPA could get for doing these projects. Can that help? Can there be help with the debt on that? I don't know. So we're starting to see more positive action by at the federal level, which definitely could be part of the solution for us here on Long Island. Because this is not unusual for, I mean, we're a little bit unusual for the size of the debt, but there are other places that have bigger debts than us. In South Carolina, I know, Ohio. So we see this problem in other states.
Thanks for that, Mike. So we are about a little over 10 minutes away from the end of our allotted time. Are there any more questions that folks want to put into the chat? We just have some next steps and action items that folks can follow up on. But we only need a few minutes for that. So we could probably take 1 or 2 more questions if there are any before we end this evening. Thank you to everyone who has already asked questions. I think they're both very important, like detailed ones about like the function of the utility and the politics around it and the different stakeholders and constituencies. So definitely keep those coming if there are further. We'll give that another 30 seconds or so. Sometimes it can take a while to type those up. But otherwise, we'll move into next steps and know that we'll be available to follow up on any of this other stuff. We'll put Mike's email in the chat towards the end, especially if you're a part of an organization or related to different community organizations or civic associations that might want a similar presentation, as we definitely need to do more stakeholder engagements as this commission process goes on to help shape the work of it and ultimately to pass the legislation that they develop through it. You know, we have to ensure that the commission doesn't just develop a robust report that the legislator is then not going to act upon. We're in a good position because it's made up of the stakeholders, the elected officials who will support the end results. But of course, we still need to make the rest of New York act in concert. So I think I did a good job talking while giving people enough time. So it seems like there are no more questions. And with that, I'll ask just Mike if you can put up the presentation again, just for the next steps. Give you a moment to do that. Great. So yeah, as we noted before, please submit your DPS comments by tomorrow. Feel free to share. I know there's not a lot of time to share it, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think most people who are on this call already submitted, which is wonderful. The next thing is we would love for you to join the campaign. There's a form that you can fill out. And we do just ask some questions to make sure there's like some alignment with our vision and mission in terms of this process. But you can also tell us that you don't agree with us and we can have a conversation about that. But that's a form that you can readily fill out so that you can join our campaign efforts. We have bi-weekly meetings and we organize events like this, and we'll be engaging in the public hearing process coming up soon. So we would love to have more active contributors to that, helping us shape how we do our work and to carry out our work. As I mentioned, we welcome folks reaching out to Mike to set up a presentation. If you're, again, part of an organization or some kind of entity that might benefit from this kind of dialogue, there's many iterations of this presentation. We could have gone longer if we would have liked. We can go into more details. So please reach out to Mike if you're interested in that. While there isn't a set date for the public hearing in November, we anticipate it'll be around mid-November. And so we are already preparing a kind of like public hearing prep session. So that's going to be at on November 10th at 7 p.m. We'll kind of walk you through what to expect when giving giving your comments, the details of like, where is it? How do you get there? Are there virtual? Can you submit written comments? And then we'll have, similar to our comment tool tonight, some suggestions for language if you need support on that. And then finally, folks may have seen there's been a couple of news articles about the commission process in Newsday, some accurate reporting on the state of affairs, others hot takes from conservative think tanks funded by right-wing conservatives. So we would love more LTE submitted into Newsday in order to support the work that the commission is trying to do. And so with that, I do see there's some like latecomers just hopping on. We were wrapping up with some next steps. But if there are no other questions, we will call it a night. We'll be sending out a recording of this to everyone who registered, as well as follow up with all of the links that we put into the chat. But we certainly hope to hear from folks soon. I hope to get some notifications that people have filled out the Google form, and we can bring you into the work, and we'll be able to move forward on this together. And in case I just saw Sylvia, if you were asking, yes, we'll be sending out a recording. So again, no worries. Thank you to everyone who joined tonight. We look forward to keeping in touch. Thanks for your time, interest, and hopefully future investment in this work. Take care.